Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thanks so much for joining us on this Saturday afternoon. My name is Ash. I'm a member of the Firestorm Collective, and I'm really looking forward to hosting today's event, the new Municipal Agenda, featuring a conversation between author and journalist Debbie Bookchin and PhD researcher in political and legal theory, Sixtine van Outryve, to discuss the revised edition of Murray Bookchin's From Urbanization to Cities, The Politics of Democratic Municipalism, recently out from AK Press. For folks who are not familiar, Firestorm Books and Coffee is a 13-year-old worker-owned cooperative and radical bookstore in so-called Asheville, North Carolina, on the traditional lands of Cherokee people. We're an anarchist collective that is well known for our eclectic mix of titles related to feminism, queerness, social movements, and radical politics. We ship books all across the country, and if you haven't checked us out yet, our full catalog is available on our website, which I will drop links to in the chat. Firestorm is also a community event space. Unfortunately, since the start of the pandemic, we've been unable to host events in person and have transitioned entirely to an online virtual space, and will continue hosting virtual events like the one you are attending today until it is otherwise safe to do so. We have a slew of events coming up in collaboration with folks like AK Press and other indie publishers, and already have some pretty rad online reading groups scheduled for 2022. So if you're interested in staying informed about events happening through Firestorm, you should follow us on social media, and I'll also drop a link to our community calendar in the chat. Just a note for those attending in the live audience, there will be time at the end of today's conversation for a Q&A. So if you're interested in asking a question at any point, I'll encourage you to submit them throughout the discussion by using the Q&A function located at the bottom of your screen if you're attending on Zoom, or in the comments if you are following along on the Facebook live stream. Cool. As for today's event, we are here for a discussion on From Urbanization to Cities, the Politics of Democratic Municipalism. First penned over 30 years ago and reworked here by AK Press. The book is a sweeping history of the city as the locus for directly democratic politics. Democratic municipalism is an emancipatory philosophy of self-determination, where politics becomes an everyday act in which ordinary people and local communities take the power of decision-making into their own hands. From the Paris Commune to the Kurdish-led revolution in northeast Syria, democratic municipalism is a tool for wresting power from the nation state, allowing capitalist urbanization to give way to humanely scaled, ecological, and egalitarian societies. David Wengrow, co-author with David Graeber of The Dawn of Everything, which I know a lot of folks are reading right now, had this to say about the recent update from AK Press. This carefully reworked edition introduces a new generation of readers to Murray Bookchin's historically informed case for reclaiming cities as the front line of participatory democracy and ecological renewal. Never has the case been more powerfully argued or more pertinent to the challenges of our time. For those who are unfamiliar and have not yet Googled Murray Bookchin, he was an active voice in ecology, anarchist, and communalist movements for more than 50 years. His work has influenced numerous movements around the world, including the New Left of the 1960s, the Alter Globalization movement, the Radical Municipalism movement, and the Kurdish Democratic Confederalism project in Turkey and Northeast Syria. Bookchin is the author of The Ecology of Freedom, among 24 other books. Joining us today to discuss From Urbanizations to Cities is Sixtine van Outryve, a PhD researcher in political and legal theory in Belgium. Her research focuses on the theory and practice of direct democracy in a communalist perspective, and more specifically on social movements struggling for local self-government in France and North America. She has also co-authored an exhibition on the Paris Commune. Along with Sixtine is Debbie Bookchin, an activist, author, and award-winning journalist who has written for the New York Times, The Atlantic, The Nation, and many other publications. She served as press secretary and spokesperson for US Senator Bernie Sanders for 3 years when he was first elected to Congress. She compiled and edited The Next Revolution, Popular Assemblies, and the Promise of Direct Democracy, a book of essays by her late father, Murray Bookchin. Debbie has been working with AK Press to bring out new revised editions of some of Bookchin's other books, which will be released later this year. You can find her on Twitter with the handle @DebbieBookchin. Sixtine, Debbie, thank you so much for being here today, and I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to Sixtine.
Thank you so much, Ash, and thanks so much for Firestorm to welcome us. So I want to ask a question to Debbie. So your father basically is known for his interventions in the area of ecology, and specifically his maxim that all ecological problems are in fact social problems. But this book here is about cities and how they can be the locus of a new form of politics. Could you please explain us a bit, how did he get from his theory and hierarchy to municipalism? Thank you.
Thank you, Sixtine. And I just want to take a moment to say welcome to everybody. It's really so wonderful to be here. I really want to thank you, Ash, and everybody at Firestorm, and also everybody at AK Press, Zach and Kristen, and all the folks who have put so much effort into putting out this beautiful new edition of the book, which as Ash mentioned, is going to be part of a series of new editions with new introductions, and they're beautiful volumes. So I just wanted to thank you, and I wanted to say also, I do hope to get someday to Firestorm in person, because just looking at the pictures on the web, it looks like a gorgeous place to have a coffee, to talk, and to have community, which is kind of what we're talking about today, you know. And I think a lot of people here probably do know that my father, you know, is known for really being probably one of the early pioneers of in the ecology movement, and for having really made the distinction between environmentalism and ecology, you know, with environmentalism kind of becoming popular back in the 60s, and he making a big distinction by saying that we really cannot solve the environmental crisis in a piecemeal way, band-aid way, putting you know, our attention 1 minute on saving forests and the next minute on air pollution, et cetera, but really have to look at what social ills inform the ecological crisis. And for him, that really meant going to not just look at economic disparities and inequality, but really to the root of all hierarchy, all forms of domination, all the ways in which status in society can be used in order to keep people oppressed and to keep people from being free. And I'm sure, again, a lot of people probably know that his most well-known or kind of biggest work and most important work on this is called The Ecology of Freedom. And that's for him, this whole question of hierarchy, of domination is really about how do we create a free, more egalitarian society. And so he, as Ash also mentioned, you know, he worked on this issue for many, many decades. But very early on, began to start to think about the role of cities. And both because cities obviously play a big role. Many people, most, as it turns out, people are going to end up living in cities, but also because urbanization, in a certain sense, reflects the natural counterpart. The municipality reflects the counterpart to the nation state. And when we think about domination and when we think about hierarchy, we have to think about how those forms of obedience and command are enforced. And really, that happens through the nation state. And so for him, a big project in thinking about emancipation had to revolve around what is our relationship going to be to the nation state. The nation state, as we all know, is very powerful. It has a monopoly on violence. He wrote, I think, one of a very lovely sentence or two about it, which I'll read. He says, the nation state makes us feel less than human. It towers over us, cajoles us, disempowers us, bilks us of our substance, humiliates us, and often kills us in its imperialist adventures. We are the nation state's victims, not its constituents, not only physically and psychologically, but also ideologically. So the counterpower to the nation state is really the municipality, in terms of sort of where the state disempowers people and alienates them from the process of being the stewards of their everyday life. It is on the municipal level where we really come together as neighbors, as friends, as family, and begin to be able to start thinking about how we can steward a collective future that responds to the true needs of people. And so the municipality, so in that sense, has the potential, he believed, of actually beginning to hollow out the power of the nation state. And he imagined that this could happen most effectively in the form of assembly democracy, in a place where people could meet and get together, share ideas, see each other as neighbors, overcome a lot of the alienation that we experience in everyday life. And so, I will actually turn to Sixtine there to talk maybe a little bit about that. And one of the things we're trying to do in this presentation is just kind of have a back and forth conversation so that we can encourage all of you to also get involved with comments and questions after we've been talking for a little bit to open things up. So I guess, I would say to Sixtine, this idea of general assemblies, of course, that my father was so interested in, it's not a new idea. It has many historical antecedents. And I think it would be great, since you're a scholar in that area, if you could, and wrote such a beautiful introduction to the book, talking about some of these things, if you could give a little bit of background on sort of how general assemblies can play this role and what some of their historical antecedents are.
Great, thank you. Thanks, Debbie, for this great introduction and question. So yeah, throughout history, oppressed people have periodically refused the exploitation imposed on them and struggled against the power that was vertically exercised over them by the state. And they organized to do so. They organized in a democratic way. They have reclaimed power over their lives, over their economic conditions, over their neighborhoods. And they did so in this democratic form, and one that actually diverges from the power oppressing them. And that was the form of popular assemblies, deciding in a direct democracy. And such assemblies have flourished throughout history during all kinds of political struggles, whether those were the medieval towns, the comuneros in early modern Spain, of which Murray talks about in his book, New England town meetings, the Paris Commune of both 1792 and 1871. We often know the one of 1871, but less the one of 1792, the second part of the French Revolution. There are also the Russian, the German, the Spanish, and the Hungarian Revolution. So these forms are what Hannah Arendt actually coined as the lost treasures of revolution, and that Bookchin also grouped under the term the underground communal world. I just want to pause here on a specific example. We can of course come back on other examples in the Q&A, though I don't know as all the examples as much. But on the one of the sans-culottes, so the sectional assemblies of 1792, because they encompass actually all the principles of communalism. So as I said, we know the French Revolution, we know 1781, or at least I know it being next to France. But during the later part of the revolution, the sans-culottes, which were the working class, basically, by opposition to the aristocracy, who had like culottes, so basically it was some kind of uniform of trousers that only the rich people would have. They restructured Paris governance that was previously dependent upon monarchy for centuries, and they restructured it into a system of self-governance. So for them, sovereignty resides in the assembled citizens who should exercise direct government. They created a system of face-to-face and of permanent and autonomous neighborhood assemblies that were called the Sectional Assemblies. And they actually were based on administrative electoral districts. So they used the existing form of the administration, but changed it with another content. And so those were the place where people would practice politics. They reclaimed their citizenship, not by voting for people who would exercise public power, knowing the fact that the vote had just extended to passive citizens, so basically the ones not owning property, of course, women and colonized people being excluded. But they exercise that power themselves indirectly. They were deciding on local public affairs, whether that is civic affairs, judicial affairs, police, the economy, tax, but also national ones, so in the constitution, on legislation. And they had a right of recall over their representatives who were under the control of those primary assemblies. They pushed actually the revolution further, not only to replace the monarchy with a centralized government, but to replace both the monarchy and representative government with a real and popular direct democracy. That's of the people exercising power through assemblies. So based on this kind of experience, this tradition of underground communal world, of which the sans-culottes is part, but there are many other examples throughout history, Murray Bookchin built a system of communalism. And indeed, this example, as I said, encapsulates the main principles of Bookchin's proposition of communalism, or also libertarian municipalism, though it can be considered as different, but we can go back on that later. So I first said they had a system of neighborhood assemblies. And in communalism, indeed, the commune or the neighborhood is considered as the main democratic unit. It's the locus for communities to directly manage their own affairs through popular assemblies rather than a nation state. It's based on sectional assemblies who were autonomous, permanent, and directly exercising public power. And indeed, communalism proposed that popular assemblies are the permanent places to meet, to debate, to decide what the community wants to do collectively. So they have, in this sense, the same autonomy of agenda that the sectional assembly has, not only the agenda that the state would leave over, but the one that they actually think is important for their lives. And they do that through face-to-face and direct democracy. And so in this sense, direct democracy, it means the people directly exercising public power rather than leaving it to a class of representatives. They also reclaim politics. Here, Murray Bookchin distinguishes between politics and statecraft. While statecraft is the domain of professional politics, politics is actually the art of deciding collectively the course of action of a municipality together. And so by distinguishing politics from statecraft, what Bookchin does is proposing a form of political engagement that ceases to pretend to know the people's will, but actually allows and gives a space for people to form that will. As I said, also, the sans-culottes had a right of recall over their representatives. At that time, the imperative mandate was less of a use, so we can come back also on that later. But what communalism, according to Bookchin, would propose is that municipalities would indeed use imperative and recallable mandates for building a confederation. So that would be a network of councils with delegates elected from local assemblies with recallable and imperative mandates for the purpose of coordinating and administering policies from the assemblies themselves. I'll just pause now to define actually what is a recallable and what is an imperative mandate. So an imperative mandate is basically a fixed mandate, a list of decisions that the assembly has made and that the delegate is supposed to embody and to enact in other instances, namely here the confederal councils that I have named. And if the delegate doesn't do that, well, then she might be recalled by her assembly and be changed like have another delegate naming it in her stead. And so to understand the conception of delegation here, it's important to see so that communalism wants to leave the paradigm of representative democracy. When delegates in fact needs, assemblies need representation in the sense of actually the very generic sense of representation, which is to make present that which is absent. Well, when we need to make the people present, because the people cannot always be present, whether that is at the confederal level, because there are too many people just to be in one room, or just for every technical details of the implementation of a policy, then it would be delegates with those recallable and imperative mandates that are accountable to the popular assemblies. And so delegates have no decision-making power, no agency whatsoever, as representatives have now in our systems. They are elected every 4, 5, 6 years and are able to implement the policies that they think the people apparently wants, even though that interest is often not at all defended. And so the purpose of delegation here is to abolish a class of professionals of politics, a class of ruler, and consider politics as the everyday activity of everybody. Bookchin also makes another distinction, the one between policymaking and administration. So policymaking on the one hand is the political decisions regarding the course of action of a municipality, and policymaking should be made and formulated by popular assemblies gathering the residents of the municipality. And then the administration of these decisions made by the municipality, again, it would be its coordination or execution would be carried out by delegates with imperative and recallable mandate and with very close supervision of the popular assembly. And the last point I mentioned in the example of the sans-culottes is the term citizenship and the fact that they reclaimed it. And of course, today citizenship is a word that is made to exclude so many people, whether that is migrants, undocumented migrants, or even documented ones, people in prison. I mean, so many categories that in fact don't fit what citizens would mean. Well, here citizens is considered in another sense. It's political participation in the self-government of the city, and not some kind of definition that would be based on the arbitrary borders of a nation state. So that's a bit all the principles that you could find about communalism and what is so important here about direct democracy. And definitely we can come back later on other historical examples. But there are actually contemporary examples as well. And one of the places where some of these concepts have been practiced is in Northeast Syria. And Debbie is, we are lucky to have her today because she is very knowledgeable about the revolution in Rojava, for having been there several times. And so I was wondering if you could talk to us a bit about this, the Kurdish experience, and share about your knowledge about this revolution. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you, Sixtine. That's such a great background to get some of the history, and it's true. One of the things that I think is really important to acknowledge about Rojava is that it's one of the few places where these kinds of ideas are really being put into practice today. The other being, of course, Chiapas in Mexico, where the Zapatistas have been doing similar types of assembly democracy. But as Sixtine pointed out, there's a big difference between representative democracy and even what we call participatory democracy, which we can discuss some more, and true direct assembly democracy, where people are not only weighing in on, say, ideas proposed by professional politicians or elites, but are themselves coming up with exactly what kinds of ideas they really want in order to see how their communities can go forward and grow in the best possible way for everybody. And so I'm sure a lot of people listening in are quite familiar with Rojava, northeast Syria, the area where 4 to 5 million people, it's hard to tell because of the war conditions exactly what the population is right now. And of course, as I'm sure a lot of people know, that includes about 70,000 basically ISIS sympathizers, about 10,000 of which are actual ISIS fighters who are in camps. So anyway, the population is complex, but basically, let's say a society of about 4 million people that's based on this idea that they call democratic confederalism, that was really fully explicated by Abdullah Öcalan, the Kurdish leader, who, and it's, there's a lot of history here, which we don't really have time to go into, but basically in the 90s and early aughts, and very much inspired by the Kurdish women's movement, Abdullah Öcalan began to formulate these ideas about, very similar to what Murray is talking about how a society could be formulated that would allow for maximum freedom and really change the way politics is done. And as many people here would know, traditionally socialist politics has kind of focused on the idea of seizing state power, and partly because of the Kurdish experience, partly because of the fall of the Soviet Union. I think growing numbers of people, certainly people in the anarchist community for sure, have realized that the seizure of state power too often simply replicates the same problems of command and obedience, of domination and hierarchy. And so the idea of generating instead a kind of a sense of the people's will by truly letting people meet together, talk, and decide on their future, and do that in a way in which, as Sixtine said, people can then delegate people to take these ideas from the most basic communal level, which, for example, in Rojava might consist in a city of a single block of about, say, 30 families, or in a more rural area, it might be a village. And so there, people meet together, they talk about whatever issues are facing the community, whether it's traffic, whether it's health issues, whether it's women's issues, and they make decisions together. And then they send delegates to the next level, which would be like a wider neighborhood level in a big urban area. And from there, delegates are sent to the citywide level and ultimately to the regional level. And I should also add that there are councils at every level of decision making that deal with specific issues. There's a council on defense, there's a council on a committee on defense, a committee on health, women's issues. And it's very important also to mention that part of the very self-conscious aspect of bringing everybody into the process includes the fact that women, of course, make up at least 40% of any governing body and are co-chairs at every level of administrative office. So whether it's a mayor or, you know, a district manager of something, every single position, administrative position, is co-chaired by at least one woman and a man. And also this is a way, of course, of bringing in, you know, to inclusiveness for the many other ethnicities that exist in North and East Syria, because it's not just a Kurdish area. There are many, many Arab people. There are the Yazidi people, Assyrian Christians. And so there's a very conscious effort to balance out and make sure that everybody is represented. But in this way, in Rojava, through this practice of democratic confederalism, we see a situation in which people are really able to reclaim their political lives, to become, you know, in a certain sense, new people, because they are consciously participating in the future of their communities. And this is an incredibly empowering thing. I saw it with my own eyes, and people are so very, very engaged there. And there is such a sense of community and cohesiveness. And so I think that when we look at this model, we really see an example of how we can sort of recreate the whole idea of what politics could be, and take it away from, you know, what my father called statecraft, which is the realm of these you know, professional politicians, and make it something that we do in our everyday lives, and that really kind of has the power to, you know, not only transform our communities, but really transform us as human beings, because of the whole sort of educational process that's involved in this kind of face-to-face democracy. And so, Sixtine, I guess I would throw it over to you and ask, you know, what are some ways in your view where some of these ideas can be put into practice by political movements today in other parts of the world? Some of the different things, you know, that we've seen in places like Rojava, obviously very unusual, because it's a situation in which the state kind of removed itself as a result of the Syrian civil war. But there are groups like Symbiosis and others that are trying to sort of promote these ideas politically now. And it'd be interesting if you could talk a little bit about that.
Thank you. Yeah, definitely. I mean, as inspiring as the example of Rojava is, it's hard to translate it into our conditions in our capitalist Western and representative democracy states. And so indeed, you've mentioned the example of Symbiosis, which is an organization in North America which has been building a confederation of municipal movements, building power through democratic institutions outside of the state. And we can definitely come back later on that. I'll try to drop a link at some point as well, so you can be directed towards their website. But there are many other examples. What Murray Bookchin envisioned to build a society based on assemblies working in face-to-face direct democracy was to realize first the self-government at the level of the municipality. And to do so, Bookchin proposes two strategies to adapt to local conditions, of course. The first is an extra-institutional one, and the second is an institutional one. The extra-institutional strategy consists basically in creating radically new and alternative institutions by building extra-legal popular assemblies and councils to manage communal affairs independently of the existing political system. And on the other side, the institutional strategy entails then participating in existing legal municipal institutions like city councils by presenting candidates whose mandate would be tied to the popular assembly's will, so it would be an imperative mandate, in order to radically transform this institution. So the goal is for popular assemblies making decisions via direct democracy to make decisions that would be later enacted by the city council, and having these city councillors as pure delegates of the assembly. And so the purpose is really to consolidate the power of communal popular assemblies at the expense of the state through either of these strategies. And again, they can be adapted and modified and extended and interpreted according to local conditions. But Bookchin is well aware that the municipality, even if it's built around strong institutions of self-government, is not sufficiently strong to challenge the state. And the strategy he proposes is to create a system of dual power that refers actually to the 1917 Russian Revolution, where the provisional government was in a share of power with the Soviets, the councils of workers. And this dual power situation would be, on the one hand, between the Confederation of Communes based on local self-governments, and on the other, the nation states. And the two of them would compete for political legitimacy. And basically, the purpose is to dismantle the legitimacy of the states in favor of the Confederation of Self-Governed Communes, which would address better the needs of the population and their aspiration for self-government. And so the situation of tension between those two forces is seen as a necessity in Bookchin's thoughts. And he insists that the Confederation of Communes and the state cannot coexist on the long term, and that the former, so the Confederation of Communes, should win and replace the state insofar as the state would have been hollowed out of its legitimacy. And so again, like throughout the world, there are many experiences like that. I'll probably come back later to the Yellow Vest experience, but in North America, at the local level, there have been endeavors like in Olympia Assembly in the Pacific Northwest, the Seattle Neighborhood Action Coalitions, also previously, which have been attempting in the Portland Assembly as well before moving to Symbiosis PDX, and they have been attempting to build out of the state. And of course, there are so many more examples that I don't have the time to mention, and most probably so many of you here are part of these projects and can definitely talk more about them than I can. But an important aspect basically of building these self-governed municipality to later confederate them in a dual power perspective is the role of education. And I was wondering, Debbie, if you could say something about why that's something that is so much emphasized in communalist politics, and what's at stake here.
Yeah, you know, it's interesting. Education is something also that Abdullah Öcalan speaks about a great deal in his work, and that has been very, very important to the Kurdish movement. And my dad liked to use the word paideia, which is a Greek word, which means sort of it's used for education, but it kind of means more than that. It really helps kind of encompass the process that occurs when people get together and talk and engage with each other. And obviously with COVID, it's difficult right now to do this on a face-to-face basis, but theoretically and hopefully at some point in the future, face-to-face is a very important aspect of that, because it's in that sort of moment where we really sort of interact in ways that, and through debate and discussion and collective decision making, that transform us, that there's a kind of dialectic in a sense between the individual and the assembly, in which each is transformed through interacting with the other. We grow, we become obviously more knowledgeable through discussion and debate about issues, but we also get to see our neighbors and our friends as, in a sense, sort of a collective stewards that have an almost like moral calling. You know, it's always a little bit dangerous in a way to quote Aristotle, white male from Greece, which had lots and lots of problems, ancient Greece. But Aristotle really, I think, was correct when he said that politics is, in a certain sense, kind of the highest calling of human beings. Right now, we're all so engaged in just, you know, trying to stay alive, trying to deal with a totally screwed up capitalist economy. in a better world, we would be having much more time to actually think about how we want to create a shared future that's safe and healthy and that is ecologically supportive instead of destructive, and all those things. So that idea of paideia, this idea that and through the process of the assembly, we kind of become new people, I think is really interesting. And I think it's not an accident that it's been so strongly embraced by the Kurdish movement. When I was in Rojava, one of the things that I saw were incredible academies everywhere where people could go and learn and study and sort of talk, and especially for women, this was especially important. And it sort of also kind of speaks to the feminization of politics, which is this, idea that we're going to bring a kind of care and sense of community to our political aspirations that in many ways we're just completely deprived of right now by the act of just sort of going into a voting booth and voting for the best possible candidate where there's no, that we think might be the best possible, where there's really no accountability. And we see that, the way people are feeling deeply disenfranchised now. So I think education is really important. And of course, that my father was really all about study groups and reading groups, and that's one step in the process. And I think another is just the whole thing that happens when we really get together and talk, and that really actually differs very much from, what we can do with technology, even though obviously technology is good for a lot of things, but ends up in a certain sense being more of a kind of a referendum. It's when we're looking at reading something and sitting in the privacy of our homes, and we're just, we think about it, but we don't really have a chance to really engage in that kind of discussion and debate. So I think that education is not unsurprisingly an important part of this process. And I also just want to take a minute, since going back for a moment to the Kurdish example, to say that, in a certain way, if the Kurdish people and the project in Rojava have found the wherewithal, even under conditions of extreme distress, the fight against ISIS, where they lost 13,000 young men and women, and now Turkey, which has really all but, tried to take over the whole region and has succeeded, in fact, in invading one area, the area of Afrin, and is now, in a certain sense, funneling ISIS fighters back into Rojava through their various, militias that Turkey backs. So I feel like, and yet they continue to have these, these universities, they continue to really have these institutes. So I think it's a great model and a great inspiring model, and one that we should also kind of emulate. And just to continue, on this, the situation obviously in Rojava is kind of, it's exciting and it's important. But you interestingly opened your introduction to the book with a quote from the Yellow Vests in France. And I think a lot of people don't know that much about the Yellow Vest movement, and sort of, we've heard lots of things about it, like that it started out as being sort of a revolt against the gas tax, and that there were some very reactionary elements. But it seems like in certain areas, specifically in Commercy, you discovered a much more radical impetus. And I'd love to hear a little bit more about that, because I think it gives a great example of how people in other areas are struggling to implement some of these ideas.
Great, thank you, Debbie. Yeah, so indeed, I'll first zoom out a bit and talk about the movements, because you indeed might have heard things that might not having access directly to the French press or the French movements. But basically, the context of the movement is that in reaction to the rise of fuel price on November 17th, 2018, there was a call to wear a yellow vest and to block toll gates throughout France. And so approximately from 1 million to 3 million people actually reacted to that call and blocked toll gates all throughout France. And what characterizes this movement is that they had very varied political ideas with some common demands like more dignity, more purchasing power, more tax and social justice, the resignation of Macron, the president of France, more political participation, direct democracy, even though that meant different things in different places. And they had also very varied profiles. So it was mostly working class, but it could go from the unemployed to retired people to factory workers to small independents. So it was very, very varied. And they had a great local diversity and a great diversity in action as well. So what really characterizes the Yellow Vest is that they didn't want to have any imposition on how they should think of, on how they should organize. It was very present in the rural milieu, which is like a bit a change from classical movements like Occupy Wall Street or the Occupy that have went throughout the world after that, the Indignados, which were all in urban areas. It was many first-time demonstrators, and they had this criticism of all forms of political organization, like party and unions, and especially a rejection of all forms of representation, even among the movements. And so that's as much as I can try to characterize the movement, it's some features of it. They had this dual form of mobilization. On the one hand, mass mobilization every Saturday in Paris, but also in the main cities, and then occupation of roundabouts and creation of assemblies there. It wasn't the case everywhere, but it was the case in a big strand of the movement. And of course, Macron's government responds in two ways against the demonstration. It was an intense repression with many people mutilated, put to jail and repressed. And again, the small debates of the roundabout, they actually demanded to select 8 representatives to negotiate in a way to kind of recuperate the movement and take the power, take away the power from below. And that's where the Commercy Yellow Vests come into play. Basically, they answered that call to select 8 representatives to negotiate with the government. And they called the other Yellow Vests to organize in popular assemblies everywhere. And so it was basically popular assemblies where everybody would participate on an equal footing. They called to construct shacks in people's houses, to take back power from the bottom, to refuse to select representatives as demanded by the government. And I quote, if there must be delegates, it is as the level of each local Yellow Vest People's Committee, closer to the voice of the people, with imperative, recallable, and rotating mandates, with transparency, with trust. Power to the people, by the people, for the people. So of course, when I heard that call, I was like, this is communalism called for by a grassroots social movement. And indeed, Murray Bookchin's ideas were present among some people in the movement. But what's interesting is that they really answered the democratic aspirations of people who would have never read Murray ever. And so in this call, there were the ideas of communist direct democracy. It was the political legitimacy of popular assemblies for as a place for meeting and for debating and for making decisions. They considered politics as the daily activity of all and not the profession of the few. They asked for equality of participation, for the permanence of popular assemblies, and for the refusal of representation in favor of delegation with imperative and recallable mandates. And indeed, since the beginning of the movement, the Commercy Yellow Vests have organized in assemblies. They took all decisions in assemblies, from demonstration to pens, leaflets, or stickers that would be put at the shack, and without any leaders. And so they built a shack overnight in the city center of the town, which is a town, so you can see in northeastern France, of approximately 5,500 people. And it was for them a place of human worth, of contact, of fraternity, of welcoming, where people would come and talk about their issues, and people basically would meet. But it was also a place of organization, of deliberation, and of decision. They had these daily general assemblies at 5:30 p.m. every single day in the winter in north of France, which was pretty cold. They had no leader. They had a rotation of tasks. They had participatory agenda, equal participation, and collective decision on every single thing. Sometimes even too much, some would have said. And then they launched a second call. It was a call this time to organize an assembly of assemblies. Basically, it was the idea of a confederation. So they asked other popular committees of Yellow Vest to send delegates from each roundabout with strict mandates. And it was the principle that the roundabouts would decide, because mainly the popular assemblies were meeting in roundabouts. And they had this system of indicative voting when there was no mandate from the delegate, which was mainly that since people would come from their roundabout, they would deliberate with them every day, they could indicate what they think, what their assembly would vote, but not tie them directly, and that would need to be ratified after by their local roundabouts. We can talk again about that later. There were several assemblies, one in Commercy, and then after it went through other cities of France, gathering a strand of the movement, the assembly strand of the movement. And it ran throughout even until the eve of the pandemic. In Commercy locally, they organized also a citizens initiative referendum. Basically, it's the people who ask for a referendum. And it was a big demand of the Yellow Vest, but they organized it at the local level, and they organized it themselves without having any institutions already, any pre-specified form to organize it. And they did that against the destruction of the shack, but they also linked to that the demand for more democratic participation as a way to reach out to people, actually. And they were like, do you want to destroy the shack or not? Because the mayor was saying that the residents would actually to destroy their shack. But so they asked the people if they wanted that. And then very smartly, they asked again, and do you want to participate more in decisions? And so they did door to door throughout the cities, and they had actually a pretty good turnout, because 575 people participated over an electorate of 3,200. And so it was, and it had 500 yes. So it was a big success, but of course the mayor was not at all responsive to that demand and to that process, and he destroyed the shack in March 2019. Then part of the group actually decided to institutionalize the assembly as a space of discussion and open it up to non-Yellow Vest residents to go beyond the struggle of the Yellow Vest, which because of some demonstration and the Yellow Vest being pictured by the government as very violent, sometimes alienated people from willing to take part in it. And so they created the Commercy Citizens Assembly. And the assembly, a few months after its beginning, decided to give a mandate to a list of people to run for the municipal elections, to give the power to the Citizens Assembly. And that is the institutional strategy of communalism. And so they created the citizens list, Let's Live and Decide Together, which has had a sole program, direct democracy, basically. It was that the mayor or elected people, if in the minority, would apply the decision of the assembly if elected. They had a big campaign of door-to-door of citizens assembly to elaborate other propositions, weekly permanence, electoral assemblies. They elaborate even a local constitution, on which I can definitely come back, and to reflect. And so they went really far in the reflection of how would that popular assembly work, how would that be articulated to the city council. And it was very interesting to actually see how a social movement would think that through, and how they would enact self-government at their level. Unfortunately, they didn't pass through the first round by 4 votes, which was very frustrating to them. And then the pandemic hit. So after the election, they tried to redefine the Citizen Assembly as a place to develop self-organization of residents through several projects and to be a counterpart to the municipal elections. But again, with COVID, it's not the best moment to organize on a face-to-face basis. So basically the political outcome of the Yellow Vest of Commercy was to run people to the municipal elections in order to give the power to the popular assembly. And I was wondering, Debbie, if you could expand a bit further on how communalism views electoral politics and why you think that approach is important at this point in time in the US, so beyond the specific context of France. Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks. That's a really great sort of, sociological look at what happened with the yellow vests. I mean, it shows, that this kind of assembly politics or communalist politics is complicated and it can be difficult, but also kind of exciting and empowering. And I was just thinking about how the fact that my father really started talking about some of these ideas decades ago, back even when he was, writing as an anarchist and about in a book, for example, The Limits of the City and other different periods. But he especially began to really elaborate a lot of these ideas just in the last 2 decades before he died. So, he was urging the left really to try and undertake this kind of communalist politics as opposed to a kind of statist seizing state power politics for a while. And for him, as Sixtine kind of outlined, it meant really figuring out how not only to maybe, be creating neighborhood assemblies, but to go into the very local kind of electoral sphere and to, for example, get elected to a city council and then use that position of power to try and funnel as much as possible power back down to the assemblies. So to, as Sixtine has said elsewhere in articles, to sort of like, for example, be elected mayor to do away with the office of mayor, or certainly on the city council level. And what I think is interesting is that he believed that by doing this, by making the municipalities increasingly strong, that itself would remove a certain amount of power from the state. What's fascinating to me is that I think we're seeing that happen right now in the United States, only it's happening at the hands of the right. It is actually, ironically, the right that has gone into the institutions. They are electing people to school boards. They are putting people, as we all know now, also on voting boards. They are taking the local level and essentially, infiltrating it, putting as many conservative activists on these kinds of city councils as they can. And they are, in a certain sense, doing what he was advocating that the left should be doing. So I think that it speaks to the fact that while we can't just focus on electoral politics without simply replicating the existing representative politics, which we all know, maybe, it's important to vote for somebody as a Band-Aid measure. Obviously, if you're voting for president, you try and find the most radical person to vote for. If you're voting for state assembly, same thing. But that the real work on the local level is the place where is the only place really where we can really begin to transform what politics means and really bring that power back into our local communities and wrest it for ourselves. It's a big process. It's not an easy thing. I think these kinds of things take, months and years and work, but I feel like we also, in the left have great experience, with working in affinity groups, with all the kinds of different types of organization that have gone into, for example, the ultra-globalization movement, and that taking some of the energy that the left has put into, demonstrations and opposition politics and bringing it into a much more concrete effort to institutionalize our politics by working with neighborhood assemblies and neighborhood groups, and then promoting this idea of sending people into local city councils who are delegates, not representatives, even if we are still for now working within the voting system and representative system of politics, that making people aware of this idea of really being accountable to the base could be a very exciting and very necessary step as we sort of try to counteract these incredibly reactionary policies of the right, and also try to build a new politics that's truly liberatory. And I'm just looking at the time, and I'm thinking that maybe it would be nice to engage some of the listeners and participants here in the conversation, and maybe start by taking some questions, Ash, if that sounds good to you.
That sounds great. Thank you so much for this robust conversation and really kind of grounding us in a foundation of what we're talking about today. We've had a bunch of questions pour in. Some are sort of getting at similar topics, so I'm going to try to group them together and try to answer them in one go. And perhaps the first one would be most appropriate for Sixtine, because you're the one who has presented some of the contemporary examples of where this is happening. So two questions in one. There's a person in the audience here who comments that the practice of getting together and engaging with one another is so important to countering apathy in politics. So their question is, how can we create spaces that will urge participation in discussions? And then there's another person who shared an anecdote that they are a musician, and they've been working in a musicians union, mostly on political education, but that has been kind of precarious because the nature of musicians is that the average person is really kind of only there for 4 to 5 years, and there's a lot of fluency to who is involved. So they're wondering how such like a non-standard workplace could learn from municipalism to organize themselves. Yeah, so a question there kind of about the spaces and the way in which people come and go, and how do we create spaces that allow for participation and discussion.
Sure, thank you, and thanks for all these questions. I've been trying to have a look at them. I'll try to be brief because I see there are several of them. I'll maybe try to answer the second, which is definitely a challenge. So definitely the municipality is not the only place where we should organize on a democratic level. The workplace is also such place. But indeed, the workplace, I mean, when we think workplace, and especially in the left movement, we think factories, and that's a unit of interest, let's say, that is pretty easy. Here, it's a big challenge because it seems like a very dispersed community. And while face-to-face is very useful in organizing democratically, actually in sometimes for a specific community of interest, whether that is some section of work or actually women or people who are oppressed because of their race, that can be organized differently. And so there could be, since it's not based on the municipality, there could be local sections of workers, so in the specific case of musicians, local sections of workers trying to organize in a specific area, and then having confederal assemblies, but at that level not having delegates, in fact, because there are less people than there would be on a general level, but having confederal assemblies where the people would meet and be able to deliberate what will be their course of action, basically what kind of struggles they would engage in, what kind of demand they would have. And I would say the main thing would be to be connected to other workplace organizing and to other community organizing as well, and other assemblies existing, and come into contact with one another. I don't think it's a satisfactory answer, and I'm sorry I don't have one. But in any case, I wish you good luck, and we can definitely talk more about that. about the importance of countering apathy in politics and how to create urge participation in discussion. Well, the example of the yellow vest and other examples, the historical ones I've given, are in times of social unrest. So let's say it's easy to drag people in, and even despite material constraints. For example, when you would see at the sans-culottes, it would be the people with the least money who would participate the most, because they would have the most interest in doing so. But there's a need to create the structures to in fact channel it once it comes, and to not start from ground zero, to not do mistakes that have been done throughout history. And so basically how to do that, that's where literature on participatory democracy can be useful, because it's been shown that people participate only when it actually matters and when they have actual decision. So as long as there are no assembly to city council, so giving a mandate to a city councillor with effective decision-making power, what would be the most important would be to build an extra popular assembly that would answer the specific needs of people through specific projects that would answer their communities' demands. And so, yeah, it's some kind of deciding. It's not a legal one, but it's already one that would actually answer the most pressing needs. And so yeah, that would be the way. But again, I mean, it's the biggest question, and it's very hard to answer it in very so shortly.
Yeah, and there's a couple of questions here concerning the neighborhood assemblies and how exactly they work. And I want to pose this first question and then follow it up with some of the others. The first one is, can you expand on the role of the neighborhood? How exactly is the neighborhood defined? Is it a geographical space or a set of people? And how does this work with online and offline spaces? Can neighborhoods exist across digital and physical spaces?
Why don't I could start talking about that, and 16, you can jump in also if you have some thoughts. I mean, you know, I noticed that a question in there was also about cities, sort of to define what is a city. And so just to step back even to that first, you know, we tend to think of cities in geographical terms, you know, by population, statistical metropolitan areas, and sort of, and as places of commerce and you know, just density, demographics. I think that Bookchin really wanted to view the city in terms much more of its sort of history, which it has to do with really the way he approached a lot of things, technology and other things, you know, to sort of understand it, to really truly understand it, you have to see how a city evolves. And of course, historically, you know, cities had very liberatory aspects to them. They were places, and he discusses this, by the way, in the book, you know, because he gives, in part of it is to talk about the history of cities. But the city had a liberatory role in the sense that it was a place where blood ties gave way to more universal notions of citizenship. In other words, anybody could come in, and instead of being a stranger, you could become part of civic life. So cities have, you know, obviously there are different definitions of them. I think in terms of, and similarly with neighborhoods, as I mentioned in Rojava, you know, it can be anything from a city block to a group of villages. But as 16 was saying earlier, I think part of the way that we can organize on a neighborhood level is to kind of find areas that are of concern. I mean, traditionally, this has happened where a group of neighbors will get together and undertake a project. It might be stopping the construction of an electrical plant, a nuclear power plant, or something like that. It might be in reaction to a crisis. In New York City, when Superstorm Sandy hit, there was a huge and this has also, of course, been happening now with COVID, but there was a huge surge of mutual aid projects where people got together because of course, as so often happens in a crisis, the state was completely absent and wasn't able to do anything to help people. So people got together, they were digging each other's basements out, getting rid of water and soggy wood during Sandy, and really came together kind of in basically in assemblies to figure out how to do this and to deal with logistics. And they did it very effectively. But what happened was that after the crisis was over, people kind of again went their separate ways. And I think what might be interesting in terms of a kind of an assembly approach to transforming politics is to take some of these moments and really try and institutionalize them, to say, hey, now that we're meeting together to deal with this, let's talk about how we can work together, maybe with other groups who have similar issues. Because as Sixtine mentioned before, a big important aspect of this idea of assembly democracy is confederalism. It's a way of really strengthening the individual assemblies by confederating together. And again, this also, we see this happening in Rojava. It's not just about people having their own parochial concerns. It's about meeting and making sure that there's discussion and debate across regional lines as well. So that's one thing. And the other thing I would say is, these things don't happen overnight. And we often think of what happened in Rojava when in 2012, they kind of declared themselves, a new formation. They're not a state, but a new, regional form of governance. But as something that was just, wow, extraordinary, look at what they're doing. But actually, all the work, the preparation of for this had been going on for years and years underground. And that includes sort of these, these academies and women talking about their roles and people thinking through structures so that when they finally came forward with their social contract, what we would probably call a constitution, but it's not a state, so it's not a constitution, which has these sort of 96 points of agreement. There'd been immense discussion and debate. So I think that's another important thing to emphasize, is that, it doesn't happen necessarily, overnight. It's a long process of engagement.
I'd love to chip in, but I really want other questions to address. So maybe I'll come back to some elements a bit later, but maybe we can go to other questions. And I think there are some for Debbie as well on Rojava. No? Oh, the academy and the university.
Yeah, okay, that seems like a good place to go, because you did actually, you mentioned that, Debbie, and a few folks have asked about the relationship between universities in Rojava and the popular assemblies. Would you be able to speak a little bit about that? Sure. And the other thing is, I will try and type into the chat at some point, places for more information, because there's so much to say about this and there's been so much written about this. We have, for example, the sweet little book, Make Rojava Green Again, which was put together by the Internationalist Commune, that talks about some of the ecological projects and how those things are organized. And it's put out by Dog Section Press, and it's available, you can read it online or order it and see the beautiful little graphics in there as well. But the academies are available to everybody in Rojava. There are certain academies that are very specific, like, for example, the women's academies are designed so that women can have a choice of either going, for example, during the day for a period of weeks, often it's usually sort of a period of a month, or even if they're able to, if they're not, burdened by feeling that they have to be home with young kids, they live collectively in these academies. And there's a whole
curriculum, that is put forward, that in which women can discuss their own experiences. They also can read ideological tracts by women from the Kurdish women's movement, by Abdullah Öcalan, discuss these kinds of things. And they also interact with people that they might not have necessarily, prior to the Syrian civil war, when there were much more, much greater divisions between different ethnicities. Right now, one of the things that's really exciting about Rojava is the extent to which women and everybody really have been able to interact in ways with other members of other ethnic groups. So all of that goes on, and there's a whole even course area called genealogy, which is really the study of not just women's history, but all history of social sciences, but from a women's perspective. So the Kurds have done a lot of work on course curricula to both address specific needs, like the specific needs of women, but also to just educate as much as possible the entire population on the idea of democratic confederalism. And so even if you are a young person who's going to join the YPG or the YPJ, the two defense units, the people defense units, YPG being the mostly male but mixed, and the YPJ being the all-female defense, you first spend a month in an academy doing sort of ideological studies. So there's just this idea that education is very fundamental to the society and that everybody has a right to it. And then, of course, on top of that, there are also universities. And I, again, had the pleasure of visiting, a couple of these universities, and they're lovely places where people are doing science and just all the kind of traditional academic studies, but also having a chance to, in some cases, students living communally and practicing a lot of the politics that they're discussing in those arenas.
Great, thank you for that, Debbie. So we've talked a little bit there about the relationship with education, universities, and popular assemblies. Some folks have questions kind of about like the specifics of how popular assemblies work, especially concerns around accessibility and participation. I think this comes up a lot when people talk about neighborhood assemblies and when do you have them? And what if people can't join? How can you find a time where everyone can participate? Along with that, there are questions about how exactly do you create these structures that can hold delegates accountable? And I think specifically when thinking about kind of like the inside strategy of electing people to city councils to then give power back to the assemblies, in what way can there be mechanisms for accountability in that relationship between elected officials and assemblies?
Sure, thank you. About the first question on accessibility and ensuring participation, to me, I mean, it's one of the most important questions. Of course, I mean, if we were in a world where patriarchy and capitalism and racism wouldn't be there, we could all be able to participate in assemblies. I mean, as long as we actually want to spend a lot of times in meeting, which can still be the case that people don't want to, but at least they would have the opportunity to go to assemblies. So as long as we don't live in this world, we have to organize in certain ways to ensure that people can still participate if they actually want to and are not hindered by material constraints. And so, for example, I mean, there's a solution, and that has been practiced throughout social movements, to have, of course, childcare during assemblies. In Commercy, it's a very old population, actually, and so they were thinking of shuttles to actually pick people up and have that as a public service to pick them up from their own place. And now about the specific time where an assembly would be, because not everybody can be there at all times. they dived pretty deep into a discussion about holding several assemblies, like 3 assemblies of deliberation, 1 assembly of decision, and to have assemblies of deliberation at several times of the week, and then 1 assembly of decision, but also having a way of recap of these 3 assemblies of deliberation, because their deepest belief is that deliberation in fact changes people's mind through the exchange of argument, of views, of you can understand what the minority thinks, and so they would have this kind of video of recap at the end, and that's actually where also the technological tools can be used through have broadcasting of assemblies, broadcasting of summing up of arguments, and voting online, having some kind of referendum after, because the referendum, I mean, it's not a sufficient tool on its own because it doesn't allow for people to meet and to have deliberation. But it can be a tool used for once deliberation has happened to vote with people. An important aspect of it, of course, is the face-to-face, with Murray Bookchin emphasizes a lot. And I mean, one aspect of it that I heard recently, a political theorist, Daniela Kamak, who specialized in ancient Greece, again, with all the shortcomings of Greece, on which we're not gonna spend time. It's gonna take all the rest of the time. But one of the things there that was important in the face-to-face is that there were assemblies of 5,000, 6,000 people, but it could visibilize the minority, in fact. And so it would allow people to understand that they could be, in fact, part of the minority. And that could indeed maybe help some people who actually think that they're being lied to, or that elections have been stolen, for example, to take a US case, that in fact it hasn't been the case, because they would see face-to-face what people indeed would think. And so that's an important argument for the face-to-face, even though technology can definitely help. Just to finish on the importance of holding representative accountable, even though the existing structure doesn't allow for it. And yes, of course, there is not many possibilities to recall a person, and especially not on the base that that person wouldn't have respected the Popular Assembly's decision. What they did in Commercy is that they drafted a charter of the elected person, which was a moral engagement. And of course, it's not binding, it's only morally binding. But the people, I mean, all the ones I interviewed that were on the list, so all the people of the list were really thinking that, I mean, anybody who would not respect that charter, it just wouldn't be possible that the other would still work with them in general. And so that they would have to be, and even if it was their own, because some people were like, maybe if it's a bad decision from the assembly, I might not want to be the person who wants to enact that at city council. They would say, in that case, then I would have to step down of this position. But in general, I think the best, so it's very feeble because it's only a moral engagement, there's not recall in the institutional sense of the term. But the best mechanism to prevent that is to build the assembly before running to the election. So there's a habit of actually checking their delegates and holding them in check, and being able to deprofessionalize politics, in the sense that people would not see and would, when they are delegated for something, they would no longer think themselves as having to use their agency, but really respect the decisions assembly. And so that's the most important to do before, is to really build this assembly. And it's sometimes a shortcoming that some movements have. And of course, I totally understand elections have their own timing, and sometimes they have to run a bit too early for that.
Great, thanks for that answer, Sixtine. Okay, maybe this can be our last question. There's more and more questions flowing in. I'm sorry for everyone who's submitting them that we won't be able to get to all of them. But there have been some links dropped in the chat there that I hope folks will check out, follow up on some of this information that's being shared. So the last question I wanted to pose, and it was something that I think Debbie mentioned at one point, and a couple folks have asked about, is the far right and their use of some of the strategy that's being talked about here in terms of electing people to boards, various education boards, and the way in which that has been effective for the far right. So I guess when it comes to something like libertarian municipalism, democratic municipalism, what are some of the ways in safeguarding against a reactionary sort of eco-fascism. And is there anything that the complexities of what's happened in other places like Rojava can help us understand about resisting those kinds of movements?
I'll just talk about that for a couple of minutes, and then I also want to just give Sixtine a chance to say any final words or thoughts, because I'm sorry, the time just flew by. You know, the only thing I can say about that is sort of organize what the far right has done. And it's ironic, of course, you know, like I did notice that in one of the questions, somebody said it's almost as if they're reading Murray Bookchin, you know, but obviously they are not. But it's a kind of very basic thing that if you want to change policy, one of the most effective ways to do it is on the local level, is you just you go into the school boards and you see what they're doing. They're banning books and they're, you know, critical race theory. It's very scary what they're doing. They literally are starting to hollow out the power of the state. And the sad part about that is that makes some people think, oh, this is why we need a much stronger state to protect us from the parochialism of the localities. But I would argue, and I think that Bookchin argues here, that that's the wrong approach. That's a kind of a Band-Aid approach, because what we've seen over years and years, decades of trying to work within the sort of more traditional representative state politics is that doesn't work either. You know, we keep electing people and having the best hopes for them, and then they keep disappointing us. And so the only thing to do is to reclaim this populism and take it back, and to ourselves go into the institutions. And as Sixtine said earlier, there aren't, especially early on, there aren't guarantees. You know, the most you can do is you can try within a local group to write a charter or to write a set of bylaws for your group, you know, and hope that the people who are selected to represent the group, either in a confederal meeting of other groups or as in an election, since we're still working within electoral politics, at least at the local level, that they will be morally, have a sense of moral obligation to the assembly. One would hope that after meeting in an assembly for a period of months, that any person that was delegated to do that would do that, you know, would take that to heart. But I think that the only thing to do is really to start doing this ourselves, to become involved locally, to get onto commissions, to get onto school boards, to organize in assemblies, and to start electing people to city councils, and to, for example, now to voting boards, and to try and, all the while that we're doing this, do it in a very self-conscious way about the idea that this is a new kind of politics. It's neither socialist in the sense of trying to just somehow seize state power. It's not anarchist in the sense that we're not just going to withdraw from all power relations, because we see that whether or not we wish power were around, it does exist. Somebody's going to have it. The question is who, and how can we decentralize it as much as possible and bring it down to the local level. And Sixtine, if you want to add to that, that would be great.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Debbie. I mean, I agree with pretty much everything you said. And I think concerning the threat of the far right, we have to differentiate between the organized one and the non-organized one. And definitely concerning the organized one, I mean, it's pretty, I mean, it requires massive organization and anti-fascist actions. But concerning the non-organized one, that's actually where I think the communalism can have something to say and to help. And it's actually something I've heard from one of the organizer in Commercy. I mean, to him, the best solution against non-organized people who would vote Rassemblement National, so the Marine Le Pen's party, he would say that, like, to have a popular assembly, basically, to force them to listen to arguments, to be in contact with actually the people who they think steal their jobs or whatever, do bad for their belief of what should be their nation. And to him and to them, actually, if they don't have people from Rassemblement National, so from the far right, again, unorganized ones, in an assembly, it's not a good assembly because he just left them out and let them again be taken by the racist and the fascist logic of those parties who surf on the discontentment about representative politics. And I mean, in the end, it would go to a discontentment about democracy, but it's just like liberal bourgeois representative democracy they would talk about, and not about actually popular democracy. And so the assemblies in this sense is the best way to in fact reach out to these people who feel disempowered and try to address their concerns in a way that is emancipatory and non-hierarchical. And that can only be done through the face-to-face and through having people in the same room and deliberating and forcing them to overcome basically their fear and the exclusion that comes from that. So yeah, again, it's not an answer for organized fascists, which is definitely one of the bigger threats, but it's one to try to tackle the disempowerment and coming from our current crisis of democracy. Yeah.
And I would just add that all of these ideas are really expanded in this book. So it's a great, it really, in this book and in other works by Bookchin, including like The Next Revolution, Popular Assemblies, and The Promise of Direct Democracy. I mean, all of which you can thankfully get at Firestorm Books. It's going to be a process. It's going to take time. But I think it's a really exciting approach to politics. And again, I just want to say thank you to everybody who's attended and listened in and who is striving for a better world.
Yes, thanks
Absolutely.
everybody.
Yeah, Sixtine and Debbie, thank you so much for being here today and offering this. For any folks who are on the call right now, anyone who registered for this event will get a follow-up email with a recording of the event. So I know a lot of information was shared today, but you will have the opportunity to go back and rewatch any parts that really stood out to you. Yeah, and thank you so much. And yeah, there'll be more coming from AK Press and some revised work by Murray Bookchin later this year. And maybe we'll be able to hold some more events to continue the conversation there. Thanks so much, y'all. Have a good rest of your day.
Thank you.
Goodbye now.